About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness studies, as well as cybernetics and anthropology, and through this series of program, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research and explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. Consciousness in psychology and medicine is usually defined as being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. But in the field of noetics, consciousness is much more. It's not only the processes and products of mind in our awareness, it's those outside of our awareness. It's also the profound human experiences that shape our lives, and ultimately, consciousness is what connects us all. So far in this series, which is now at 6 months, we've looked at a number of models of what consciousness is. We started with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and their ideas from the early 20th century, over 100 years ago, explaining how much of what goes on in the mind is not in our normal awareness. It is, in fact, unconscious. Over the next few decades, people continued to explore, and Charles Tart in the 1960s described various states of consciousness that now are a normal part of all research around thinking and the brain. Julian Jaynes introduced the idea of the separation of the right and left hemispheres of our brain to help us understand how people become aware and how they experience things that seem outside of our normal awareness. We then looked at some of the field models of mind that have been developed. Kurt Lewin early on, and then Rupert Sheldrake and others, trying to explain how it is that the mind affects and is affected by the body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel, which brought up how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness. And we looked at the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami, as well as others, who are exploring the way that quantum entanglement and other characteristics of the quantum world apply to our experience of consciousness. We then looked at the global brain, as described by Peter Russell, and the noosphere of Teilhard de Chardin, as well as Ervin Laszlo's ideas about a global mind, and went on to the field of transpersonal psychology, which applies many of these ideas in their therapy and research. We then came back to how the body and the mind interact, looking at Bruce Lipton's work with biological membranes and chemicals, and Candace Pert, who talked about hormones as molecules of emotion, leading to, ultimately, a biology based on our psychology and belief, which led us to the possibility of a coherence, a state of consciousness in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions are in alignment. We then explored some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness. That included support for telepathic communication between two people, experiments that showed how mind can affect the matter around it, and experiments in what is called clairvoyance or remote viewing. Then we talked about the different states of consciousness that facilitate those different experiments and how we move across different states every day. We explored how those states can be talked about as frequencies, and we can move into higher and lower frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and in the heart using the work of Penny Pierce, the study of cymatics, and the water crystal experiments of people like Masaru Emoto. And in the last few episodes, we've looked at the healing process and the role that our consciousness and energy flows in these vibration patterns play in the body's response to threats and distress. You can catch up on these past shows on the KXCR.net archives. Click on the little cloud up in the banner at the top of the KXCR.net screen, and on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, the books, and authors that I mention in the show. Today, I thought we'd talk a bit about the brain itself. Now, the brain is an amazing organ. It's one of the few things in the universe, maybe it may be the only thing in the universe that can study itself. But the brain is huge in a tiny package. The human brain contains about 100 billion neurons, making roughly 500 trillion synaptic connections between those neurons. Now, those neurons typically fire 5 to 50 times every second. So every minute, a quadrillion or so synaptic activations occur inside your head. That's a lot of activity. And so all that activity creates this background noise that is constantly going on. And these patterns form in this background noise that become experienced as the signals, the information that we call mind. If you think about how many billions of neurons there are and how many trillions of firings may be going on, you can see that there's a very large number of possible patterns. And some scientists have suggested, are you ready for this? It's 1 followed by 1,000,000 zeros, possible patterns that our mind could be taking or that the neurons in the brain could be making. Of course, there are limits on that at any given time, and that is true of any system. But that's a lot of potential. And this may be the basis for the notion that we're only using 10% of our brain. At any given time, we're aware of a very, very small part of all of that neuronal activity. Much of what is going on in the brain doesn't appear to have anything to do with what we are aware of. Now, some of that has to do with the different parts of the brain. Each of the parts of the brain has a different function. We can talk about the functions of the brain by the physical structure, and we can talk about it in terms of the electrical activity. I want to look first at the structures. We can talk about the structures as 5 general kinds of things. There is the frontal. There is the parietal, which is kind of the back, upper back. There is the temporal, that is close to the ears. The occipital, which is the lower part of the back. And then there is that basic spinal ganglion that is the brain base. Those areas each are responsible for different kinds of things. So the frontal lobe is associated with reasoning and planning and speech and movement and emotions and problem solving. And so when people have a stroke or an injury in the frontal lobes, then we can see the issues that are often associated with exactly those things, reasoning and speech and the like. The parietal lobe, which is associated with movement, orientation, recognition, and the perception of stimuli, is located, as I said, in the upper back. And then that occipital lobe in the back is where signals from the eyes or the imagining of visual objects, it lights up. And then the temporal lobes are associated with auditory stimuli and speech, and often memory. So each of these 4 areas has a different role in the experience of our world and of our thought processes. That brain base, if you will, the brain stem, takes care of the relationship between the brain and the body. There are various kinds of organs within the brain, and they each have different roles associated with what we've talked about. And one of them that you may have heard of is the limbic system. This is very near the center of the brain. So everything that I've just described is around the outside edge, and near the center of the brain is the limbic system. It's sometimes called the emotional brain, and it is evolutionarily very old. It includes these organs of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Each of those have a profound impact on how we begin to relate to the world around us. So if we think about the brain in those ways, we can see that each of parts of the brain have evolved to handle different parts of our experience. Now, how do we know this? I'm going to let you listen to a YouTube that helps explain that.
So how do we study living brains without harming their owners? We can use a trio of techniques called EEG, fMRI, and PET. Each measures something different and has its own strengths and weaknesses, and we'll look at each in turn. First is EEG, or Electroencephalography, which measures electrical activity in your brain. As brain cells communicate, they produce waves of electricity. Electrodes placed on the skull pick up these waves, and differences in the signals detected between electrodes provide information about what's happening. This technique was invented almost 100 years ago, and it's still used to diagnose conditions like epilepsy and sleep disorders. It's also used to investigate what areas of the brain are active during learning or paying attention. EEG is non-invasive, relatively inexpensive, and fast. It can measure changes that occur in just milliseconds. Unfortunately, it's hard to determine exactly where any particular pattern originates. Electrical signals are generated constantly all over the brain, and they interact with each other to produce complex patterns. Using more electrodes or sophisticated data processing algorithms can help. But in the end, while EEG can tell you precisely when certain activity occurs, it can't tell you precisely where. To do that, you'd need another technique, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. fMRI measures how quickly oxygen is consumed by brain cells. Active areas of the brain use oxygen more quickly. So watching an fMRI scan while a person completes cognitive or behavioral tasks can provide information about which regions of the brain might be involved. That allows us to study everything from how we see faces to how we understand what we're feeling. fMRI can pinpoint differences in brain activity to within a few millimeters, but it's thousands of times slower than EEG. Using the two techniques together can help show when and where neural activity is occurring. The third, even more precise technique is called positron emission tomography, and it measures radioactive elements introduced into the brain. That sounds much scarier than it actually is. PET scans, like fMRI and EEG, are completely safe. During a PET scan, a small amount of radioactive material called a tracer is injected into the bloodstream, and doctors monitor its circulation through the brain. By modifying the tracer to bind to specific molecules, researchers can use PET to study the complex chemistry in our brains. It's useful for studying how drugs affect the brain and detecting diseases like Alzheimer's. But this technique has the lowest time resolution of all because it takes minutes for the tracer to circulate and changes to show up.
So these are the 3 common methods used by researchers and by medical practitioners to understand what is going on in any given person's brain. And then other scientists come along and they analyze hundreds or thousands of such scans to try to understand what is normal in the human brain. Supplementing these scanning techniques are surgical techniques. discovered early on when epilepsy surgeries were being done. People have used probes in the brain and had people respond to whatever was being touched. And that has been a very powerful tool for many people to figure out, oh, this is where this kind of thing happens, or here is where this person is experiencing such and so. And those probes have led some scientists, particularly the what I call the hardline materialist scientists, to think that that's where those parts or those activities or those experiences or those thoughts are generated. However, it isn't the same in everybody's brain, and are a range of results, not the same over and over again. Not just because no two individuals are alike, but because there is something called neuroplasticity, which says that, as Joe Dispenza likes to put it, neurons that fire together wire together. So if you have the same thought over and over and over again, and you attach certain emotions to that thought, then if I were to stick a probe in a particular packet of neurons, they would have wired together around that thought and those emotions, regardless of what part of the brain they were in, except if it's auditory, it'll tend to be in temporal. If it's visual, it'll tend to be in the occipital, etc. What that tells us is that the various regions of the brain are able to receive and transmit information of specific types. That's all it tells us. So more and more people who are involved in the field of noetics are beginning to think of mind as field and brain as receiver transmitter, receiving from a larger field that it is helping to generate. So it's a feedback loop. Receiving the thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories, images, possibilities, perceptions, all of that stuff, making it into patterns that are then transmitted in and through the body through those molecules of emotion that Candace Pert and Bruce Lipton and others involved in the fields of epigenetics and neuropsychology have been exploring. So we have a marvelous, marvelous device here that, in technical terms, is a transducer rather than a source of consciousness. At least that's what the science appears to be telling us more and more. And if we buy into the model of a global brain, noosphere, or collective consciousness that several of the people we've looked at over the last few weeks have suggested, then we can say that the brain is not only receiving information and possible perceptual frameworks and stimuli from the individual mind, but from the collective mind. And if we use Rupert Sheldrake's work, then we're talking about an even larger kind of notion of the minds that are in resonance with our minds, that is, have a similar or harmonious pattern of frequencies and vibrations, will have more direct connections with our minds. That is, when we change, they change. When they change, we change. So the theory of morphic resonance that Rupert Sheldrake suggests, combined with the collective consciousness that Carl Jung suggests in the noosphere, the global sphere of consciousness that Teilhard de Chardin suggests and others are working with these days, we start seeing the brain is like a cell tower, basically. It is constantly receiving, and that's part of that constant activity, that neuronal activity we talked about early on. And that's constantly accepting possibilities, but only those things that fit the patterns that the brain has been trained by us through our conscious thought processes and unconscious experiences to be stored in memory or stored in the body or in any way worked with. They're always happening. Now, how can I say that? Well, we just got a new study out recently in which they were checking to see whether the brain will accept auditory stimuli even with the auditory parts of the brain shut down so that it isn't being transmitted to the conscious part. And guess what? You can be sound asleep, and when you are sound asleep, if there is a sound, you don't know what it is. You don't even know. The brain does not acknowledge it in any way, even though it clearly receives the information. But because the overriding program is sleep, that sound is not allowed. Only the sounds that you have told the brain can override your sleep program will be allowed in. For example, an alarm clock. And how many of us have slept through the alarm clock because, whoops, we were so tired it wasn't even relevant to us? Yes? And at the same time, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that the brain is functioning not in parts, but that when consciousness happens, it is a total brain state. That is, every part of the brain is affected. You may recall a while ago we talked about a man in France who had less than 5% of normal brain tissue. Now, there's many possible explanations for this, both material and non-material. One material explanation is that it isn't the neurons that do the work after all, but some other material in the brain. And there is some work published in the journal Nature Neuroscience this past spring with what are called astrocytes. ASTRO, as in star, CYTES, or it could be astrocytes, which make up half of brain tissue. And it suggests that they play a much bigger role in the transmission of information in the brain than previously thought because of how they manipulate chemicals. Another material explanation is that there are other neurons in the body that do a lot more than we thought in the way of receiving information, generating and or transmitting information, which then brings up those field models of the brain that we've explored several times, including Rupert Sheldrake's work, which I mentioned earlier today. So we really don't know a whole lot about how the brain works, but we're learning. And the more we learn, actually, the more we have potentially an understanding of the consciousness that we are, how it works, and what we can do with it. All right. I hope this has been helpful. I know that I have been kind of working around the whole question of what brain has to do with consciousness. And it seemed to me that it was time, now that we had enough different models that we could draw on, to begin to make some sense out of all of that. Well, all right. That sound tells us that it's time to check in. You are listening to KXCR.net out of Florence, Oregon. This is the Noetic Moments Show. And we're about to talk about something that's in the news. And something that's in the news is the use of something called psilocybin, or, quote, magic mushrooms, to help people with different psychological and sometimes physical conditions. So I thought I'd let someone talk to you about that. Here we go.
Humans have been eating hallucinogenic or magic mushrooms in ritual and spiritual contexts since at least 3000 BCE. But despite how long we've known about magic mushrooms, we actually barely know anything, well, about magic mushrooms. Or more specifically, about psilocybin, the molecule that makes these mushrooms so special. There's over 200 species of fungi that produce psilocybin, which makes them hallucinogenic. But this molecule itself isn't the one that causes hallucinations in humans. You see, the body strips off a phosphate molecule from the psilocybin to form a different molecule called psilocin. And it's psilocin that actually sends people on a trip because it binds to one of the same receptors as serotonin. serotonin, which is the molecule involved in things from sleep and blood pressure to mood regulation and depression. The receptor is 5-HT2A, which is also targeted by other psychedelic drugs like LSD, MDMA, and mescaline. And scientists still don't know how or if molecules binding to the 5-HT2A receptor result in hallucinations, but they think it's related to how parts of the brain communicate with each other. And a way they think that psilocybin is doing this is by strengthening the connections between brain networks, even for areas that weren't strongly connected before taking psilocybin. In mice, for example, psilocybin may actually be creating entirely new connections. In people, psilocybin increases the strength of the connections responsible for how you sense the world, while also decreasing the connections responsible for how we understand signals from our environment. And some scientists think this mix and match on how we sense and understand signals from our surroundings is what may cause an altered state of consciousness, one of the side effects of magic mushrooms. For right now, this research about connectivity is still fuzzy and sometimes conflicting, in large part because research into the effects of psilocybin is so new.
Clearly, we are looking at something that we don't know a whole lot about, but what we do have is a fair number of statistics that say people who use these chemicals under certain circumstances experience beneficial results. And it's based on those statistics that different kinds of policies have been being implemented, and we'll be curious to see how that emerges. Isn't it cool that there is the possibility that using one of these natural chemicals in our planet can help us maybe resolve or form new connections in the brain? For folks who are dealing with connections that have been failing, that might be a very positive outcome. We'll have to see. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll look at more of the research being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience life differently when we use our consciousness fully. We are out of time today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there is a list of the titles and other resources that we refer to on each show, along with the archived show, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon, and have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.